What is up, and welcome to the Dynasty Refinery, where the goal is to separate misinformation from true information in Dynasty fantasy football and to get you practical, actionable content. I am your host, Cal Shoemake. I'm at Calvin and Hobby on Twitter. Thank you so much for tuning in to this introduction to this show. This is going to be a series, and it's brought to you by DynastyLeagueFootball.com. If you don't already have a premium membership, make sure you do that. Subscribe to this channel, hit the like button. Every time you hit the like button, Addison has like little dopamine hits that make him happy in his brain, to make sure that you do that. This is session number 1, and we're going to start by diving into how to use apps and tools to help analyze and make better decisions in our drafts, trades, and everything else that we do. I think this is one of the more underlooked aspects of like when it comes to gaining an edge in Dynasty, like how we can get an edge on our league using apps, using tools. It's something that most new players likely don't know that much about. And even seasoned players sometimes can get overwhelmed by it. So we're going to dive in and to sort this out. Couldn't be more thrilled to have Addison Hayes as our first guest to help walk us through that. You probably know him as the YouTube star of the Dynasty League football channel, but there's so much more to Addison. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in statistics at Penn State University.
Yes, sir.
He's a statistics guru and an Excel master, also good at Google Docs, apparently. I learned in the pre-show. He founded FF Statistics and developed many apps and tools that are now part of DynastyLeagueFootball.com or DLF. He just wants to help people win their Dynasty Leagues. Addison, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I don't know what to say after all of that, man. I feel like I'm in your shoes sometimes, but to be on the other end of that it's a weird feeling, but thank you.
I do think a lot of people, like, they just kind of see you as, you know, like you're giving fantasy football advice, you're doing this, but there really is like a lot about you that I am excited to dig into here and to talk about. And so, in fact, I'm just going to open it up to you and just say, like, hey, okay, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, I joined the industry back in 2017. I started writing for Dynasty Football Factory, and basically from that point, in the spring of 2017 through that whole entire NFL season, I was really just gaining, a whole bunch of data and stuff like that. Like I was constantly writing articles and everything. I felt like Carp at one point. He's just like churning out like 2 articles a week, or he does even more, but that's insane. But that's like what I was doing back then, gathering a bunch of data, and I was keeping it just because, I didn't think that I should delete it because I could use it for something else down the road. Didn't want to do work again. And it was at the time, it was just such an annoying part of the research process, was like going to 10 different sites to try to find yearly stats, then weekly stats. Then you got to find fantasy finishes. And then you got to find what this team did historically. And it's just a whole bunch of stuff. So that's what eventually drove me to, wanting to create a website that kind of housed all of that. And that's where FF Statistics came from. That's where my background in our Shiny comes from, where I built a lot of the tools and stuff. And another thing that was part of my statistics major at Penn State. So I was learning all of that kind of simultaneously for school, and then applying that to the fantasy football world. Created FF Statistics. Then it was bought by DLF, and I've been with DLF then since 2019, the fantasy season of 2019, I believe. And then just got back into creating fantasy content, which has been kind of my space on the YouTube channel for the past almost a year now, coming up, like really diving in almost a year now on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, and even like solo shows, like you really you get out there, you do a lot of different things, which is really cool. And man, we could probably spend a ton of time even just talking about the YouTube part, because I know there's so much to learn there, so many different things. But today you're gonna help us learn about how to use those apps, use those tools, making better decisions. But first, I'd like the audience to get to know you a little bit better with some lightning round, lightning style about me questions, and then it's gonna be followed up with some word association. So You ready?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Favorite team?
NFL, Steelers. Yeah,
Steelers. Pittsburgh Steelers. Favorite player?
I have struggled with this because growing up, it was like 5 different players on the Steelers. I was really blessed to see 2 Super Bowls through the first like 15 years of my life. So I
Mhm.
just loved all those teams. And then fantasy football, how can you only like one player? I got attracted to like Drew Brees and Arian Foster winning me fantasy championships. It What really hit me though was Big Ben's last game at Heinz Field.
Hmm.
And so I have to go with Ben Roethlisberger. I know everybody's, all this off-field stuff, but he was the only quarterback that I really knew for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like I started watching in 2004, his rookie season, and he's the only quarterback that I've known for my team. And so yeah, Ben Roethlisberger.
I totally know where you're coming from with Sean Payton leaving the Saints. Complicated person maybe, but like, gosh, he's been the head coach of my team since I was whatever, like 15 years. So
Yeah.
Okay, favorite movie.
It has to be, dang it, probably Endgame. Just the hype for Endgame, waiting that whole year. I think that's fast what it is.
Yeah, very cool. Morning person or a night person?
Night person, 100%.
What is your favorite book?
You're asking a 25-year-old in 2022 what his favorite book is. The Alchemist. That's probably it. Yeah,
right.
that's like one of the only books that I actually own. So
good, I like it. What about your favorite quote?
Geez almighty, I wish you would have told me what these were so I could prepare. Dang, I had a quote from somebody as my background for the longest time, but I don't even remember what it is now. I bet you I could find it though real quick because it's right in here. This is amazing.
This is great. This is my favorite part.
Is this it? Your future is created by what you do, not tomorrow, but today. I don't know who said it, but that was what it is.
I like it. What's the first fantasy football podcast you could remember listening to?
The Filmetrics podcast. I think it was Nick Whalen, and I don't remember who the other person was. It was part of the DLF group at the time. The DLF Dynasty podcast was another one too, before like Ryan, Dan, and Matt got in as well. That was 5-6 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
Should fantasy leagues have kickers?
No. And defenses. No, they both can go.
I was going to ask you, IDP, team defense, or none of the above?
No, none of it. None of it.
None of the above. Okay. What's something you used to believe that you now know is wrong?
The first thing that came to my mind was something that I had to learn really quickly for Dynasty was how important age is in the community valuation. And man, this was like the first thing that I tweeted out when I joined the fantasy industry. Back at the time, I tweeted out, I would rather have AJ Green than Amari Cooper. This was 2017. This was Amari Cooper's like third year in the league, still with the Oakland Raiders. AJ Green was 4 or 5 years in the league, perennial 1,200-yard guy. AJ Green was like 4 years older than Amari Cooper. I said I'd rather have AJ Green than Amari Cooper at their prices. And that sparked like a month-long Twitter argument, dude, with like 10 different people. Like Kyle Richardson was in there. I had like Christopher Beans and Jerry Sinclair, like all these people like on both sides of it. It got articles written that got views on sites, and it was just this whole other thing. But I learned very quickly that I was semi wrong, because age is a very important part of Dynasty, obviously. But I had to learn that very quickly. Sometimes when you're a new Dynasty player, you want to win, and so you're like, yeah, I'll take Adam Thielen, I'll take all these old running backs and stuff, but you need that age, or else you're gonna find out the hard way.
Great point. Okay, now some word association.
Oh boy.
Statistics.
The first word that came to mind was Bayesian, and I think that was because I watched a video with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was talking about Bayesian statistics on if you're living in a simulation. So,
okay. All right. Nice. I like it.
Yeah.
Film.
Metrics, because I just said that.
Okay. Zero
Not
RB.
Useful. The real strategy. That's it right there.
ADP.
Useful guide, but not everything.
Trade calculators.
Helpful, People need to learn the values of trade calculators. People really crap on them because people read into them too much, but they're more helpful than you think as a tool.
Rebuilding.
I don't like to do that. Never rebuild, just always reload. You're good.
Always compete.
Yep.
Regression.
First thing I thought of was linear. That's my statistics background coming in. Positive, negative. Oh, yeah. Okay, we're done with that one.
Stacking in Dynasty.
Clutch, dude. That thing, like, yeah. I saw the power of that one a few times this year. That Mark Andrews, Lamar Jackson week, and like week 4. Yeah.
Superflex.
Not what people think it is. Man, I could have a whole separate video on Superflex. I've gone into it with John Hogue and people. That Superflex is a band-aid on the issue of quarterbacks in fantasy football.
Oh, interesting. Tell me. A band-aid as in like there's a problem and we're solving it the wrong way?
Yes. Yep, exactly. In Superflex. So the problem with quarterback scoring in fantasy football is the scoring itself. All of the quarterbacks, on a weekly basis, they can vary a lot, but on a yearly basis, a lot of the quarterbacks are within maybe 500-600 yards, which in fantasy is not a lot of points. They're within maybe 7 or 8 touchdowns, unless you're throwing 35 or more. Obviously, those guys are different, but a lot of those quarterbacks, and the rushing is a huge issue for fantasy scoring. That's why, like, if for some reason Jalen Hurts is the greatest fantasy quarterback, but he's horrible in real life, and he could have like a 25 QBR, but because he had 100 yards rushing and a touchdown, he was the QB5 on the week. I don't agree with that. So Superflex is a band-aid on fixing quarterback valuation in fantasy football, but because people believe that if you have 2 of them that you have to start, that makes things more valuable, when in actuality, teams in Superflex could win just as much with, Kirk Cousins, Tua, and Carson Wentz, and just cycling through those, as the people who, go QB early and they had Patrick Mahomes and Kyler Murray. I think it's at the end of the year, that quarterback scoring difference is not going to be that quarterback scoring difference is negligible compared to the value that is placed on those quarterbacks. So the real issue, which I've tried to fix, is the scoring itself. We need to change how quarterbacks score fantasy points, like how we did with integrating PPR, how some leagues do it with points per carry, or different PPR levels for quarterbacks or for wide receivers and running backs and tight ends. We need to fix quarterback scoring and not just have it be 1 point every 25 yards, 1 point every 10 rushing yards, all that nonsense. So, yeah.
So that's so crazy you went there, because the very next one I was going to say is Konami code was the next word association. Anything?
I mean, you have to have a Konami code quarterback. That's why I like Taysom Hill was fantastic, as you know, for fantasy, but is not the best NFL quarterback. And I think that is a problem, because as much as I want to say with a lot of other stuff that this is a game and we shouldn't reflect the NFL in a lot of different ways, the quarterback issue is really bad in fantasy football, in my opinion, to where Konami code quarterbacks is just anybody who can rush for 50 yards in a week is going to be a QB1. And it doesn't matter if they throw for 100 passing yards and throw a pick. If they have 75 rushing yards and a touchdown, they're a QB1.
So I'm going to push back a little bit, but I want to give you a chance to respond, because so I this is something I thought about, and I was actually having this conversation with someone else. And so, yes, if so many times we look at traditional passing numbers for quarterbacks as the way that we, like, for a while in baseball, we looked at batting average as that's the thing that we look at for, are you a good hitter?
Right.
And that's changed, where now, like, on base percentage, like, OPS, things like that are much more like what we look at. And we're like, oh yeah, it is good if they end up on first base. It doesn't matter how they get there. Like, that guy got on first base a lot more than that guy, but his batting average is worse. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
He's still,
I know what we're doing.
Yeah. So, like, here's something, like, how you do on third down, how you do in the red zone is
Mm,
pretty important.
mhm.
Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles, 4th and third down percentage, 8th in red zone percentage.
Okay.
So they're like those rushing numbers, yeah, it's like, oh, well, it's quarterback and their running numbers, but that does have an impact and a change on the game when on third down, you can pick up that third down with a 3-yard run or a 4-yard run. So
Mhm.
it might, like, it doesn't look pretty. Like you said, the QBR numbers might be wrong, but it's also possible we're looking at some of the wrong numbers when we're judging some of these quarterbacks too.
I think then what we should be looking at is trying to quantify and give fantasy points to first down percentages. Just
Mm,
how many times do you get a first down in a drive or something like that? Or those fourth down percentages, like you mentioned. Obviously, we give a lot of points to touchdowns in any variety. If you play in a
mhm,
6 point per passing touchdown league, then that gives 6 points to every touchdown for every player, no matter what it was. My issue is, if, like you said, if it's 3rd and 3, right? And the quarterback can either throw for 3 yards or run for 3 yards. But that in fantasy football is scored drastically differently. If he passes for that 3 yard first down, that is 0.12 fantasy points. If you're in a
mhm,
0.04 per yard league, that's 0.12 fantasy points. Whereas if he rushes for that, that's zero point 0.3. That's almost 3 times as many points if he just
mhm,
ran for it versus passing for it. To me, those yards should be, created equally, in my
mm,
opinion.
mhm.
And so that was one of the points of a refined quarterback scoring process that I have. It's on Twitter somewhere. Might even be my pin tweet. But where I treat rushing and passing yards equally for quarterbacks, and you also negate quarterbacks for sack yardage because sacks are a quarterback stat. So it's just one of those ways to try to, fix and refine the quarterback scoring so that those rushing and mobile quarterbacks aren't as impactful, for fantasy football.
So let's talk a little bit about the tools and the app. So,
Yeah.
just want to start off with, like, okay, let's just right off the jump, somebody that says, like, Addison, listen, I watch Red Zone. All right, I watch Monday Night Football. You know, I have a favorite college team. I watch them. I I kind of know who's good and who's not. I watch highlights,
Mhm.
whatever it is. Why do I need to look any deeper than that? Like, I know who the good players are. Why do I need to do any more work than that?
I'm I mean, I would argue that you're actually losing the edge. So often now, people are so invested into finding an edge by any statistical measure whatsoever, and that could be something that Pro Football Focus puts out, like yards per route run, or separation, or yards created for running backs and stuff like that. So just watching the games is not as helpful anymore compared to what it might have been like a decade ago when I first started playing fantasy football. So the whole world of fantasy and the NFL in general has really, you know, moved towards this statistical kind of approach, like how baseball and other sports have.
Hmm.
Um, and the pushback on it is really weird, but whatever. That's a whole different conversation. But for fantasy football, you need to be invested into what's going on within the game, not just the box score, but you need to understand player usage. You need to understand, even down to, man, there are some crazy articles out there that people find for, like, for DFS edges, like the wide receiver cornerback matchups, I think are insane. Or like, this team is super heavy zone, and Justin Jefferson is really good against man defense. Adam Thielen's really good against zone, so this might be an Adam Thielen week. Like, stuff like that is like super crazy to me, how deep people go. But
Hmm.
that is kind of what you need to do if you want to be successful in fantasy, or whatever, however you define success in fantasy. If it's winning a milli maker on DraftKings, or if it's just winning your home league, all of that kind of stuff could, you know, ultimately help you be successful in whatever you need. You just need to go deep enough.
Like you said, I guess the best case right there is, like, if somebody is saying that, like, everybody else in your league is probably doing that too. So, like,
Right.
what's going to make you better? And sometimes our eyes can lie to us a little bit, and we can overvalue some of those highlights or some of those like, oh man, look at that sick run or that spin move that guy had.
Yeah.
Whereas then you go back and like it can be a little sobering sometimes to look at the numbers and look at the stats. And you have a quote on your Twitter that stats don't lie, people do. What's
That should
the
have been my favorite quote. Dang
yeah,
it.
there you go. That's probably
Missed
your favorite quote.
opportunity.
There you go. What's behind that? Like you tell me about that.
That one is basically, you hear a lot of pushback on people can make stats tell whatever story that they want. They could cherry
Mhm.
pick stats. They could say 80% of the picture with this stat to fit their narrative and then leave out the other 20%, stuff like that. So really all that one is everything in the statistics, I believe, is there. You just have to have the knowledge to be able to tell the complete story and paint the entire picture when it comes to looking at everything statistically. I believe that that's one of the reasons why I'm like 95% an analytics guy and not a film guy when it comes to college player evaluations and stuff like that, just because stuff can get really subjective. People can see what they want to see,
Mm,
and at the end of the day, even if people are using analytics and stats, they can still come to the wrong conclusion.
mm.
I think that is a person problem, not a statistical or analytical problem. So that's where stats don't lie,
Mm.
people do come from.
Very interesting. So then obviously it means we need to learn how to use the tools the right way. We also need to know the tools themselves. And let's just introduce a few of those. And I'll just ask you, like, I guess, and in general, somebody like kind of
Mhm.
just starting out, never used a tool, never used one of these before, like what would maybe be like two or three that you think would be a good, like, hey, get this into your rotation, like use these, it's going to help you, like just like a couple as an introduction.
The I mean, on DLF specifically, obviously the trade finder and the trade analyzer, I think those two people have commented before. They say access to those two apps pay for the subscription themselves.
Hmm.
That's the big, those are the tools that Russ and I use for the trade show on this channel. And that, I mean, I'm on those constantly. If I'll even get DMs, be like, what do you think about this trade? I'll run it through the DLF trade analyzer real quick and just be like, I already have my opinion on how it is, but I want to see, if the analyzer backs it up or not. And most of the
Hmm.
time, um, I my opinion reflects what the analyzer says most of the time.
Hmm.
But I'm not taking it. Yeah, that the analyzer is a whole different thing. I mentioned that with the calculator and stuff. But the biggest one that I use, maybe I'm just like super partial to it because it was kind of my baby whenever I coded it out, was the scoring history app on DLF. So this one, when you open it up, is going to be a dashboard, and immediately you'll see quarterback scoring for 2022 or whatever year it currently is. I guess it's 2021. So it's going to show quarterback scoring for 2021, broken down by fantasy points, have their yearly stats and stuff like that. You can change the scoring from its defaults to PPR, but you can change it to half, standard, or you can customize it as well. You can add points per carry. You can do tight end premium. You can do anything crazy that you want to fit your scoring. Then the entire app is going to shift to how that scoring works. So it shows yearly stats. Then if you go to the second tab, it'll show a breakdown on a weekly basis of where players finished on a weekly basis by position. So that one's also really helpful as well. Then it shows percentage time in the top 5, top 12, stuff like that on the third tab to show percentages over a year range, and a bunch of other stats in the last two tabs as well, just graphs and charts and everything that you need to kind of get a really good feel for how players have performed over however many years you're looking at. And all this stuff goes back to 2000. So if you really wanted to, you could check out like players in the 2000s, like LT and all that stuff, or compare what, Austin Eckler's doing to somebody in the 2000s, like Brian Westbrook or something. I don't know. If you want to do that, you could. So that is like the biggest one. That's the one I use all the time. And more often than not, when you're watching a YouTube video and I reference stats like that,
Mm.
that all comes from that app. And sometimes I'll even throw the graphics in there as well from that app. So that's the biggest one that I use on like it's like basically just a tab that's perennially open inside my
Yeah.
Google Chrome. Yeah.
So can you think of a time where that specifically helped you, like in a make a decision or like make a draft pick or like come to a conclusion on a player that, like kind of sticks out in your mind?
I mean, one of the things that I used it for all the time was looking at like running backs and stuff. Like when I'm looking at running back values for startups, well, I was a big James Conner proponent before the season started, just because
Hmm.
I was like, we've seen that upside before. They just lost Kenyon Drake, who had like 200 something carries the year prior and all these touchdowns. If Connor comes into that workload, he's going to be a monster. And he was drafted after Chase Edmonds as well. So
Mhm.
that really worked out. And then, it just helps with a whole bunch of other stuff. I kind of changed my tune on Josh Jacobs because I saw how,
Mm.
productive he was on a weekly basis over the last year. He had like 80% of his games inside the top 20 in 2021, which was higher than a lot of other running backs. And that was one of the parts of my Dynasty discount video that I dropped a couple weeks ago, comparing him to Antonio Gibson.
Mm.
Um, so just basically, all of that kind of stuff. I dropped a short on Kareem Hunt and Leonard Fournette, saying that they each have like 3 RB1 seasons over the past 4 years, but nobody seems to care just because
Mm.
they're like 27 years old. And,
Right.
just stuff like that is all stuff that I get from that app.
I know prospect, draft season's coming up. Like you mentioned, kind of prospect analytics. Like, are there some kind of do's and don'ts that you sort of adhere to when you're thinking about analyzing these prospects? And, I know you're starting your process, going through, trying to figure out, where you land on a lot of these. Like, what are some of the things you sit down to first time you look at a player at all? What are some of the first things you're going to?
One of the first things, and I'm trying to work through this, but I need combine data. But
Mm.
I'm trying to work through it in terms of what we have production for the class that we have right now. Um, is I have looked at what players in the NFL have been successful at the running back and the wide receiver position specifically. What types of players have been successful. And, obviously you hear all those things. Well, wide receivers, you need a young breakout age. You need to hit this
Mm.
dominator rating. You need to do this. You need to be drafted in the first round, like all that stuff. Running backs is kind of it's the same thing. You need to have had that production and the volume, show that you can do that in college, be drafted in the first round or whatever, and then, show that you can have some sort of a reception work as well. There are markers that I look for, and I kind of introduced this last year during the draft season. There's 8 markers that I look for at running back and 11 or 12 that I look at wide receiver, to kind of help shape out how my feelings and my rankings for each class are going to be. And so those are actually highlighted in the prospect analytics app on DLF. It shows, I believe it should go backwards, but at least for 2021, it shows how those players were sorted out. And, with that, obviously you can kind of, you know, modify how those markers work. Because, for example, Najee Harris hit 5 out of 8 markers. And I mean, 8 out of 8 markers is like, those are the Jonathan Taylors. Joe Mixon was in that class. Ezekiel Elliott, a bunch of fantastic running backs over the past few years are 8 out of 8 type of running back players. 7 out of 8s are also really good as well. That's where you get like Saquon Barkley and Javonte Williams and Nick Chubb. Like a lot of those running backs are 7 out of 8s.
Mm.
Once you get down past there, you can start classifying some of these players and fit them into molds in the NFL. Najee Harris was a 5 out of 8 player, but I kind of gave him some passes on some of them because he played for Alabama, and
Mm.
just Nick Saban doesn't like to start freshmen and sophomores, and he was behind Bo Scarborough and was it Damian Harris? I don't remember who the other
Yeah, he
player
was there.
was.
Yep.
And that's a Nick Saban Alabama thing. You kind of have to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. Like the whole, would this wide receiver on a worse college have a better dominator rating or whatnot?
Mhm.
So I gave Najee Harris a pass. He was still my RB1, and obviously that's worked out, especially with him being a first round pick. But that was another reason why I did not like Trey Sermon and I liked Elijah Mitchell, was because
Mhm.
Mitchell hit on more markers than Trey
Interesting.
Sermon did.
Yeah.
So it's stuff like that where that kind of a process has been pretty successful in finding those late round players, or players that can kind of come up out of nowhere and be pretty successful at identifying the busts, which
Yeah.
is equally as important, if not more important, when it comes to college football, and prospects, is identifying the busts as much as it is identifying the breakouts.
So what are those 8 markers?
For running, I have it listed here. Running
Okay.
back, it is a first or second round draft capital, a BMI of 30 or above, which is generally, the 5'10" to 6 foot, like 205 and above. I do have it as weight over 200 pounds.
Okay.
You need a 4.640 or faster,
Hmm.
so under a 4.640, which then translates to a speed score over 100. Which generally, if you're over a 30 BMI and 200 pounds and you run under a 4.6, you're hitting on a 100 speed score.
Mm-hmm.
And then the production ones, where I need to see 1,000 yards from scrimmage, total yards, in either your freshman or your sophomore season, and I need to see one single season in college of at least 25 or more receptions. Oh, the last one is yards per carry, career yards per carry over 6, to just show that you were kind of efficient. Some players, like Saquon Barkley was at like a 5.9. I'm like, oh my God. Like that was the one that he didn't hit on. So some of that stuff can kind of come with a grain of salt. But what's funny about those 8 markers is they all seem relatively simple to hit on. Like individually, they shouldn't be that difficult for running backs to hit on if you are worthy of being like a first, second, or third round prospect. But it's kind of like parlaying all of them, being able to hit. Like if you on just any given Sunday were to just parlay 8 money lines on picking games, you're not going to hit that a lot, in a given season. So it's just being able to check off each individual box, and that makes successful running backs. I have the same thing for wide receivers. It's geared toward them with yards per team pass attempt and market share and breakout age and stuff like that. So
now, how did you come to those 8? Like, is that something that would every person who I guess is analyzing these rookies have like a different checklist, or is this something that is some shared info? Like, how did you come to these 8?
Yeah, I mean, I had a fantastic database from Peter Howard. So on his Twitter, he has it. It's in his Patreon, but it's free. It's just housed on his Patreon is his prospect database that goes back to 2005, I think. So I basically merged that with my NFL database, just filtered down to running backs that I'm looking for to have. I forget if it was one or multiple top 24 seasons of production, or maybe it was even top 12. I'm not sure. But I basically found the players that were successful at an NFL level. What did they have in common collegiately? And that was a lot of the markers that I found. And you can definitely have different markers if you're looking for different types of success. Like if you, and you can definitely probably grade that based on like draft capital. The expectations for Najee Harris were drastically different than the expectations for Elijah Mitchell, just at their draft position. So you could do all of that stuff. But for fantasy football, and what I was looking at was just what makes a successful running back at the NFL level, and what do they do at the collegiate level. And those are kind of the things that I want future prospects to be able to hit on, to tell me, all right, these guys are based on history, have the skills necessary to be successful at the next level.
Now, you mentioned BMI there, and that became a pretty hot topic last year, not with running back, but with Devonta Smith. And that was, gosh, I feel like we spent so much time on Twitter talking about that. Devonta Smith didn't explode on the field, which is great. BMI is, I think, misunderstood in general by what people mean by that. So do you want to just take a second and explain why you think BMI is still important to include in that for you?
BMI. So I made actually a whole video on if BMI is important last draft season, specifically targeting the people who were shaming Devonta Smith. And it was funny because everybody who was using the BMI argument against Devonta Smith didn't look at who the players actually were who had a sub 25 BMI at wide receiver. They were literally 95% of those wide receivers were like 7th round picks and didn't do anything in the NFL. Like, and the one player who was like Deshaun Jackson, and
Mm.
who obviously we know to be really good in the NFL and had fantasy relevance as well. But I was it's a really weird argument for BMI because it is an outdated measurement of your, you know, proportions and stuff like
Mhm.
that, especially for NFL athletes, because like anything above 25 for a, you know, a middle 20-year-old human being is like obese. But
Yeah.
obviously, these guys, you know, are like the best athletes in the world.
Right.
Um, but BMI, the reason why I have BMI in there specifically for the running back position is because the NFL, I think, has a bias towards it. This is something that I've learned a lot from Christopher Beans
Mhm.
on Twitter, who's part of Dynasty Football Factory. Is, you know, we know, or I don't guess I can't say we know. We believe that players like Giovanni Bernard or Naeem Hines, or other players like that,
Duke
and
Johnson. Mm,
yes, Duke
mm,
Johnson. These
mm.
guys had workloads and sustained volume in college, but
Mhm.
because they're 5'9", 190 pounds, they can't run between the tackles in the NFL. That may be true. That might not be true. And so the NFL kind of has this bias
Mm.
towards a prototypical size. You know, that's why you see LeGarrette Blount get the ball on the goal line and not James White. You know,
Right.
so that is kind of a thing that I'm trying to project what the NFL thinks of these players
Mm.
to be able to do. And then, you know, obviously how the NFL views these players is how we should be viewing these players. And that is why BMI is a marker for me, because other running backs in the past have been that BMI and they were really successful at that BMI and at that size. And other running backs, while as much potential as we think that they have coming out of college, the NFL profiles them and
Mhm.
just doesn't give them that opportunity.
I like that distinction because what you're saying, you're not saying that you think it's important. You're saying the NFL thinks it's important.
Mhm.
And that's what we should be paying attention to because they're the ones that are making that decision. I like that distinction that you're making there. And yeah, like I guess at a certain point, the NFL didn't like for quarterbacks to run, like right. They wanted
Mhm.
them to win in the pocket. So I guess you could adjust it based on if the NFL adjusted that. If they were like, oh, James White actually is more efficient at the goal line or whatever, like we want to give
Mhm.
him, 350 carries this year. If that became the truth of the NFL, then obviously then we start making changes to those. Is that something like, do you think there are, do you get worried about like having your models get outdated? Like, are you constantly trying to kind of look
Uh,
back and figure out if they're right?
yeah, a little bit. I am kind of, especially as the NFL evolves, you know, and we kind of see, you know, the NFL over the past decade or however has been moving away from the Adrian Peterson workhorse type running back who they're just gonna have one guy, he's gonna do it all, and he'll never get hurt. And if he gets hurt, we'll just have another guy do it all.
Mm-hmm.
As we see that moving away, you know, you think about like the Detroit Lions, we want DeAndre Swift to get all the work, but Jamal Williams is hogging up rushing attempts. Packers, you know, all these different teams that are utilizing two running backs more, and that's, I think, going to be something that I will have to adjust for in the future. It's just when I see those running backs come across that profile super successfully, like a Javante Williams, like Travis Etienne was an 8 out of 8 prospect as well.
Hmm.
And I was pretty high on him coming into, you know, the season before his Liz Frank injury. But it was just, you know, one of those situations where when I see a player like that, I'm going to bet that that talent ultimately should win out. Like what we saw Jonathan Taylor, you know, like that.
Mm.
Hopefully, if the NFL and the coaches see what I see on paper, that should pan out. It is kind of a double-edged sword, I will say, going back to the caring about what the NFL cares about. And it's a double-edged sword at the wide receiver position because the NFL,
Hmm.
I feel like, overvalues speed at the
Hmm.
wide receiver position to a degree. Obviously, if you have Tyreek Hill and he just runs faster than everybody on the field, that's going to be super important. But how many times have we seen those players that run a sub 4.3? They get drafted in the first round. They weren't actually deserving of that first round pick, and they were only drafted there because of how fast they were. You know, John Ross, Henry Ruggs,
Yep.
those Darius Hayward Bay was like the first one to happen to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is a double-edged sword when you care about what the NFL cares about, but you just have to be smart and you know, stick with and trust your process. You know, I'm a Sixers fan, so trust your process.
Trust the process. There you go. So speaking of that, I guess like just not just for the NFL, but like anytime you start digging into statistics, you always come across things where you're like, man, we're not quite good at picking up on this. Like, what do you think like the next step for analytics or those kind of tools, or like what's something that like hasn't quite been built yet that you can see in the future we start analyzing it in a better way, or somebody hasn't quite done the homework for it yet?
Oh man, man, I feel like there's so much stuff that we could be doing collegiately that we're not. You know, if one of the biggest struggles if you're a fantasy analyst and you're trying to dive into college data is you're so dependent on people like Peter to just churn out that data, because there isn't a resource like that for college football. We don't have like standardized game logs to be able to build out databases like what Ben Baldwin's doing with NFL Fast R, which has just opened up a whole different avenue of opportunities for analyzing NFL data that we don't have that for college yet. Hopefully, you know, and obviously all the stuff that Next Gen Stats is doing with being able to like track where players are, how fast they're moving, you know, all that stuff in real time, like those really cool like 2D charts that you see with like the little player circles moving around that they chart like a touchdown or something like that. There's so much that I feel like can be collected and analyzed at the NFL and college level. That is the next stage for NFL analytics, which is going to filter down to fantasy football. And that is really where I believe that the NFL game is going to kind of move away from film a heck of a lot and being able to trust what the data is reading out. Because the data at the end of the day is going to be numerical values of what the film is. And that, you know, is where stats don't lie, people do. That's where I believe the NFL is headed. But it's going to take probably another decade or so before we get anything remotely close to that. But yeah.
I love that you mentioned the Next Gen Stats there, because I agree with you. That's like exit velocity, things like that for baseball started opening up like all these different things, and just, yeah, that more of that information, more data, and having smart people like you around, Addison, to build those tools and help us out when we're trying to figure out how to dominate our leagues and gain that edge. I appreciate you spending time trying to separate some truth from some fiction there. And I hope everybody listening learned something. I definitely think I did here, because yeah, there's these tools, these apps. If we can utilize those in our dynasty leagues, like I do think we become smarter and we gain that edge, and we start realizing that there's a lot of people in our dynasty leagues that aren't taking that seriously and aren't looking into those things, and maybe just buying into some narratives and buying into things that like aren't necessarily true. So
like the San Francisco 49ers having a running back carousel, you know, that's just,
there we go. There we go. Well, Addison, thank you so much. And yeah, tell everybody. So we can find you at Amaze Hayes _. Obviously, find you on YouTube making videos, becoming the next YouTube sensation. And yeah, anything else that you have going on that you want to tell anybody about?
No, those are the two main things. If you're watching this and you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe, because I like to, you know, make a whole bunch of videos using these tools and apps to help you guys and just give you the information as easily and as quickly as possible to help you guys win your dynasty league. So this YouTube channel is so important to me.
Dive into those statistics and those apps. If you want an opportunity to do that, you can go to dynastyleaguefootball.com. I know there's a bunch of great apps created right there by this man, Addison, and you can find those. Go sign up. You can use the code BetSperts. Is that right? For a 20% discount?
through the end of January. So if you caught this before the end of January, code BetSpurts. Otherwise, we have a code down in the description as well for $5 off. But the code BetSpurts will give you $10 off.
Very good. Thank you, Addison, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.